Good morning, everybody. I've been told I should announce that we should turn off our cell phones or turn them to silent. It's a reminder to myself too, so I don't take any calls in the middle of our class. Also, I wanted to mention there's just a very short syllabus that if you want to pick it up on your way out, it just tells you what each week's topic is. Dr. Williams is at a conference this week, so I'm a solo act today. Next week, when Dr. Williams is back, we will have a list of suggested readings, just if you're interested in further reading. And some of the readings are very Nashville specific. Some of them are a little bit broader and more contextual. And we'll try before the class to get it posted on the course site. So I wanted to, so today our conversation is focusing on how African Americans in Nashville defined freedom before, during, and after the Civil War. And I thought I would begin in medias res with a slide of, a very lovely slide of the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, we can't really read it here, but it's an image of the proclamation, and on the left side are images of bondage. On the right side are images imagining freedom. And if we think about the Emancipation Proclamation, this piece of paper signed by President Lincoln that it purported to turn some 4 million men, women, and children across the South from one legal category, slavery, to another legal category, freedom. I think it's, in many ways, it's an incredibly important foundational legal document. And then at the same time, it's important to look at the key provisions of the Emancipation Proclamation. So in the first paragraph, we see, I do order and declare that all persons held as slaves in, and then much of the proclamation is just a list of territories that are either covered or exempted by the proclamation. I do order and declare that all persons held as slaves within said designated states are henceforward shall be free. And then there are a couple paragraphs that follow, right? And I hereby enjoin upon the people so declared to be free to abstain from all violence unless in necessary self-defense. And I recommend to them that in all cases when allowed, they labor faithfully for reasonable wages. And then finally, another paragraph saying, and I further declare and make known that such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed service of the United States. Right now, if we are looking closely at this key legal document, right, the document that makes so many people free, we have to ask, how does it define free? Right? It says, all persons held as slaves henceforward shall be free. Right? And then it says, people so declared to be free. But there really isn't much definition. By free I mean what? Right? And the slide that this illustrated Emancipation Proclamation suggests some versions of freedom. On the right side, we see people at leisure, right? Something that was in short supply during slavery, right? People going to school systematically denied to slaves, people voting, people spending time with their families, right? We can imagine that as freedom. But the proclamation itself doesn't define it, right? We think about freedom, it's something that it makes sense. It seems to be an item of common sense, right? We all know what free is. But do we? Right? It's not simply a state of being, right? Its meaning fluctuates. And we've seen in the previous two meetings of our course how slavery was a category that had variable and contingent meaning, right? There were all kinds of different experiences of slavery on the frontier, in the city, within the city, people who were hired out or people who were owned by the city, on plantations. And that same variation, right? That same contingent quality holds true with freedom, right? There's no one meaning of freedom. It means different things to different people at different times in different contexts. There's no one singular experience of liberty. And there's no one authority to tell us what it means. Right? President Lincoln might have had a particular idea about what freedom means, right? And maybe one involves being able to work for wages, getting paid for your work, being able to sell your own labor. Right? That seems like a hallmark of freedom, but it's not the whole thing. Being able to act in self-defense, right? That seems to be really an important part of self-ownership, right? Possession of one's body, control over one's destiny, right? Being able to fight in the military seems to also relate to freedom, but it doesn't seem like that's the only definition of freedom. And so the president is hardly the only legal authority to be able to define freedom, right? Legal authority is fractured in so many ways in the United States, right? It's not just the president who has the legal authority to define the values that unite us as Americans, right? It's not just Congress. It's not just the U.S. Supreme Court. It's not just the federal government, right? There are also state governments. There are also local governments. They claim a large degree of authority, right, over what we can and can't do, right, or what we can and can't expect as free people. We could say the authority is split among different agencies, right, or even among individual bureaucrats within various governments, right, whose missions overlap and compete with each other. And that's kind of the American way, right? Power is divided, it's fractured, it's sliced, it's diced. And what that means when power is so diffuse, when legal authority is so diffuse, in a way, it assures that individuals have a voice, right, in defining freedom for themselves, right, for better or worse, right? It allows people to push their own versions of what they think the boundaries of their rights are. So, how did Black Nashvillians define their freedom? So, let's first start thinking about defining freedom before the Civil War. We know that there were free African Americans living among the first settlers of Nashville. And but let me start by saying that at the end of class last week, Dr. Williams mentioned a woman named Sarah Thomas, and also known as Sally Thomas, who had a laundry business that was located near where the Doubletree Hotel is now, right downtown. And her life actually illustrates the contingencies of both slavery and freedom. So she's someone who came to Nashville as a slave, right? But her ownership was actually in limbo. It was in dispute in probate court in Virginia. And the claimants were all in Virginia. But she was here in Nashville, right? Basically all on her own at the corner of Cherry and Dederick. And, if you asked her, are you free? I mean, she might say no. She might have a different answer, right? But also if you ask, who can claim you as their property? She would have to say, I don't know, right? So, technically she was classified as a slave, but, functionally she was very much independent. And, if we think, what did freedom mean for her, right? How did it look through her eyes? And part of it meant working independently, right? Having her own business. And, you can see this with many of the early free African Americans in Nashville, right? You see it with Robert Renfro, who ran the tavern on the public square. You see it with the sailors, right? The stevedores, the riverboat men who were working up and down the Cumberland and beyond. You see it with the free man of color who had grown up in slavery here at Belmead. But then after his liberation, he went downtown and opened a hotel for the black men and women who worked along the river, which he called the Hotel Afrique. And for Sally Thomas, freedom in many ways, we might not classify her as free, but freedom was on her mind constantly. It was a dream, it was an aspiration, and it was an insistence that she had for her children. Now, often we think of freedom as the right to tell everyone else that they can go to hell, right? It's the right to do whatever you want to do. It's like Greta Garbo, right, saying, I want to be alone. I mean, with my law students, it's a very dated reference, even with this crowd, pretty dated reference. But people like Sally Thomas or Robert Renfro, or I'll talk about a couple other people, Sherrod Bryant or William Carroll Napier, they couldn't keep to themselves. Freedom did not mean the right to be left completely alone. You think about if freedom's the right to tell everyone that they could go to hell, hell was all around them, right? There were so many reminders of slavery all over the city, right? It's not a very big city. We'll look at a map shortly. Everywhere you look, there are reminders of bondage, right? There are markets where people are being bought and sold. There are stocks where people are being held in chains, people are being whipped, right? There are coffles of human beings, right, attached, chained person to person, right, who are on their way out of Nashville, right, going to places in the South. And for free people of color, it's a reminder of, and even for people like Sally Thomas who were independent, right? It's a reminder of how different their lives were, right? But also how precarious their status was. And in order to be secure in their status as freed people, or as free people, they had to have patrons, right? They had to have allies in the white community. They had to have networks, right, where there were people in their corner, right, who could stand up for them, who had influence, or who would do business with them, who would lend them money. Right? In order to become free in the first place, people had to have white allies in order to stay free. Right? So for Robert Renfro, right, it was his freedom turned on a petition to the legislature. Right? And he didn't write that petition. Right? It was white people who knew him, who could claim to attest to his character, right, his non-threatening nature. Right? And they stood up for him. Sally Thomas had powerful allies. And they helped, in the course of doing business, right? She gained this network. And it was a network of people who helped her free her children legally. Right? She had 3 sons. And when her eldest child was 10 years old, she placed him with a riverboat captain, right, doing work up and down through Tennessee and points south, right, especially in Alabama. And that captain eventually bought her son and freed him. So he became free legally. At a certain point, it seemed like her probate case was going to be resolved in a way that would require her and her children to go back to Virginia and essentially be sold off. And at that point, she told her second son, Henry, to escape. And here on a river, right, there are these paths to escape that don't necessarily exist everywhere else. And he wound up in Buxton, Ontario, right, a settlement of free African Americans in Canada. And he never saw his mother again, but he did stay in touch. And her third son, James, he was alleged to be the child of a Tennessee Supreme Court justice who then was appointed by President Jackson to the U.S. Supreme Court, John Catron. And Sally Thomas was able to convince an influential lawyer, Ephraim Foster, to purchase James and then to let him learn the barbering trade. And then eventually Foster went to court and was able to free James. Right? So that kind of network really matters. Right? And in some ways it's liberating, and in some ways it's very constraining. Right? You think about other free people of color in Nashville. You think about Sherrod Bryant, who is a man who owned lots of land in Davidson and Rutherford counties, also owned slaves, and he departed from the norm of African American slave owners being people who owned their families when there were prohibitions on emancipation. Right? Instead, he actually owned slaves who weren't his family. And after he died, there are records in the Davidson County archives of probate court proceedings where it seemed like his heirs were very intent on trying to make as much money as they could from all of his property, right? Real, personal, and human. But in order to flourish as a landowner, in order to flourish as a slave owner, right? Potentially he was a figure who could have been viewed as subversive or threatening to the order of things. And it was by having patrons, right? Having people in his corner that he was able to sort of move ahead in his existence. We think about William Carroll Napier. He was a man who grew up on his father's plantation His father had 4 children, including him, with a seamstress whom he claimed as his property. And he grew up on his father's plantation, but through his childhood, he had a job of trucking in all his father's produce, right, into the city. Right? So many of his hours were independent, right? And he had the experience of being active in commercial affairs on his own, right? And it's just not something that could have happened without having a powerful patron, right? His father. And eventually he was freed. His family had to leave and go to Dayton, Ohio. But then within a couple years, they were back in Nashville, the Napiers in the 1850s, right? William Carroll Napier and then his son, James Carroll Napier, right? Other members of his family. And you think, how can they come back, right? And how can they be assured that in coming back, they would be able to live free lives and prosper? And much of that depends on, how they situated themselves, right, in a larger community. Now, so freedom required these kinds of relationships, right? At the same time, freedom also meant that there were all kinds of opportunities for community building among African Americans in Nashville. And you see African Americans before the Civil War laying the groundwork for all kinds of cultural institutions, right? All kinds of religious institutions, educational institutions. Next week, Dr. Williams will talk about cultural and religious institutions in Nashville. But the first black churches, right, in the city were created as offshoots of white congregations. And we can talk about schools. Now, in a couple weeks, Dr. Williams will talk about institutions of higher learning in Nashville. There are many of them. But before the Civil War, there were thriving primary schools in Nashville for African Americans. Starting in 1833, which I think it's remarkable. The first school for African Americans founded in Nashville in 1833. This is 2 years after the Nat Turner Rebellion, right, where the entire South, the white South, was incredibly paranoid about any assertion of black liberty, right? Incredible amounts of vigilante activity, right? Terrorism all through the South. And 2 years into it, a school opens in Nashville. And it's a school that's educating free black children, but it's also educating children who are being held in bondage. And what you see is the schools close down, and they're shut down, by mobs periodically. Mobs would run teachers off. And there's a map of Nashville in 1863. I'm just going to tilt it on its side, just so north points north, right? And we can see that this is not a big city, right? Pretty much the city is just our downtown. And there's a school there, right? It opens, it closes, but then you see schools that keep reopening. So there's an 1833 school, there's an 1838 school, an 1841 school, 42, 1844, 1850, 1855, 1856. And often the schools were able to open because they had the support of powerful white patrons, right? Church elders who just wanted everyone to be able to read the Bible. And the locations keep changing. So maybe we tell a story that this was very threatening activity, and the schools had to operate in knowledge of their constant insecurity. But it's such a small city, and so whenever they're opening, they're not going far. And it's a small city, and it's really hard to hide. Right? Some of these schools have 40 students. They have 50 students. They're not operating in the dead of night. And some of these schools last for 5-6 years. Now, amazingly, there's an account of these schools written after the Civil War by a man named Daniel Watkins. And he writes in the third person, and he writes in a very reserved style. But when he describes these schools and as they open and close, what you notice is that just about every one of them has a principal and schoolmaster, and then there's an assistant teacher. And the assistant teacher is always Daniel Watkins. And he's someone who was touted to be, by white people as just the right kind of African American to be running a school. A conservative man, a real rule follower. But his project was radical, right? His project involved creating a large cohort of literate African Americans. And his students included many of the leaders of Black Nashville in Reconstruction and many other Reconstruction leaders outside of Nashville. So Sally Thomas sent her oldest son, right, who had worked on the river and then was freed. She sent her oldest son to study with him, and he eventually became a congressman from Alabama during Reconstruction. William Carroll Napier's son, James, studied with Daniel Watkins. Right? I think everybody had maybe slightly traumatic memories of working with Daniel Watkins. And Napier, James Napier, became Register of the Treasury of the United States. He came back to Nashville from Washington and helped found the 1-cent savings bank, right? Still going strong here. And along with his wife, Nettie Langston Napier, became a pillar of early 20th century Black Nashville, right? Very politically active. In a few weeks, we'll talk about the 1905 streetcar strike, and he was a leader in that. And Sally Thomas herself opened a school in 1846, 4 years before she died of cholera, and she had 40 students. Now, the last of the black schools before the Civil War opened and closed in 1856. And Daniel Watkins was instrumental in the 1856 school, lasted about 7 or 8 months. And then he opened his next school in 1862. And what enabled him to open his school in 1862? He opened it as soon as the secessionist government abandoned Nashville and the U.S. Army occupied it. Now, I want to pivot from pre-Civil War experience to Civil War experience. How freedom developed, evolved, changed during the war. So the Army occupation in the Civil War was a key moment in how freedom was defined by African Americans in Nashville. And much of that work happened on St. Cloud Hill, right, where Fort Negley stands. And early on, right, the Army came into Nashville early 1862 and realized that the city was really vulnerable to attack. They brought in an Army engineer. I think if you graduated, first or second in your class at West Point, all of those guys were kind of channeled into the engineering corps. And most of the people I write about did much worse at West Point. And they brought in an engineer, General Buell, and General Buell sort of took stock of the geography, and he realized that St. Cloud Hill was a key inflection point. Right? It was a place where, from that elevation, you could see what was happening south and east of the city, right? And it was a place where artillery could be used to important effect to defend the city. And Dr. Bobby Lovett has written about Fort Negley and its origins very well. Nashville had so General Buell realized there should be a fort there. He also realized it had to be built really, really quickly. And Nashville had this large population of free African Americans and also a substantial slave population with important skills, right? Blacksmithing, carpentry, stonemasonry, wagon making, all kinds of things that would be very useful to the U.S. war effort. And in trying to get the fort constructed as quickly as possible, in the first instance, the Army required local slave owners to provide laborers for construction, right? So very quickly, more than 1,000 people, right, men, women, children, were camped on the slopes of the hill. And their labor involved stripping the hill of trees, right? Kind of grueling work that also characterized life on the Nashville frontier. And then it also involved hauling blocks of stone into position, right, to lay the foundation of the fort. And the people who were the city slaves, right, who were brought onto St. Cloud Hill, right, were essentially commandeered by the Army. They were joined by a different kind of army, a huge number of people who fled bondage in areas surrounding Nashville, and they found their way across U.S. Army lines to freedom. And the presence of the U.S. Army emboldened people all over Middle Tennessee to resist their enslavement. So here at Belmead, right, when the owner of the plantation was arrested, right, many people held here either stopped working or left or would hold political meetings, right? And it gives the lie to the kind of accounts that you get at many plantation tours, right? About happy servants working in harmony with the owners whom they held in great affection. Right, so Fort Negley wound up populated with all kinds of people who had liberated themselves, right? And they wound up contributing mightily to the enterprise of constructing the fort, right? And it was built by people who were labeled contrabands of war, right? So here's an illustration of contrabands escaping. And that was a term, the term contrabands, right? It's contraband of war. It means forbidden property, right? And it was a term that Army officers applied to escaping men, women, and children. And they applied that term in part as a legal fiction, right? Initially, the Army orders were that if any people cross Army lines, the Army would have to return them to the people who claim them as property, right, to slave owners. And for many Army officers, this was repugnant, right? And here's a moment where you see legal authorities split, right? You had brass in Washington issuing a policy, but then they were a world apart, right, from officers who were in Virginia, right, let alone officers who are in Tennessee, right? And so those officers saw the people crossing their lines. Those officers spent time with them, talked with them. They were often very impressed with how they evaded the defensive positions, right? And so they wanted to figure out a way to refuse to return the men, women, and children to the people who had enslaved them, right? So it enabled officers technically to follow their orders, right? It was expected of them that they would confiscate contrabands of war, right? Even when the policy relating to human property, right, was different. And the label was applied to the men, women, and children, and it was a label that stuck. Everyone adopted in pretty short order the term contrabands of war. There's a really fascinating article on this, I think in the Journal of American History, by a historian named Kate Major. And to the extent that there was a phrase that could go viral in 1862, it was contrabands of war. Right? It was used by whites, it was used by African American activists, everyone used it. But it was a term that highlighted the contingent status of those escapees, right? It suggested the uncertainty of the people to whom that term was applied, right? Were they free or were they property? Now, the people here at Fort Negley were much more than contrabands, and really they were much more than fugitive slaves. You can't call them fugitive slaves. They've liberated themselves. No one can claim them back, right? They can't be regarded as slaves who have owners, right? They were men, women, and children who had claimed freedom for themselves. When they got to Fort Negley, when they got to St. Cloud Hill, they were no longer slaves. And camp life, for people everywhere, this is a contraband camp in Virginia, was hard, it was dangerous, right? Winter on St. Cloud Hill was cold. People got sick. People got hurt on the job. Several hundred people died on the hill. And I think it's important when we consider the hardships of camp life to keep one thing in mind. First and foremost, African Americans kept coming to Nashville, right? They kept coming to St. Cloud Hill, right, to Fort Negley. And they found ways to thrive. I mean, in their minds, despite the hardships, right? We should know this. Despite the hardships of camp life, it was obviously better than the alternative. So, Fort Negley, it's just been named a UNESCO heritage site. And, if we think about why, I think it's important to think about it as a place where people started out as contrabands, and then they wound up citizens. So, in the course of building the fort, they convinced Army officers that they could be soldiers. Right? On November 5th, 1862, Nathan Bedford Forrest, leading cavalry, attacked the city east of the fort. Right? He was beaten back and had to retreat. The army, the laborers at Fort Negley asked for guns. Army wouldn't give them guns. But the laborers used axes and shovels and spades to make a stand and defend themselves. Now, many Army officers and many people across the North doubted the fitness of African Americans to serve in the Army. People said that if you had been a slave, you had been so cowed, so dominated, right? That one was too passive to serve as a soldier, right? There was widespread belief that people would flee from danger. And at root, these kinds of doubts were doubts about African Americans' fitness for citizenship. Now, the construction of the fort was completed about a month after Nathan Bedford Forrest's attack, December 1862. And you flash forward 2 years, right? And the experience of building Fort Negley it convinced officers in Nashville that it would be worthwhile to raise regiments that were known as U.S. colored troops. And 2 years after the completion of Fort Negley, December 1864, all doubts about the fitness of African Americans to serve the national cause were erased on the second day of the Battle of Nashville. Right, this was a day where John Bell Hood's Confederate Army had ringed the city to the south, right? And on the first day, the Army, U.S. Army pushed the rebels sort of back to Brentwood, basically, and on the second day, soldiers in the U.S. colored regiments charged up Peach Orchard Hill, right, really close to Travelers Rest. And it was the site of the heaviest fighting, right? It was a site where black troops died by the dozens. And it was a site where the colors, right, U.S. flag and regimental colors were carried all the way up the hill. And that experience, right, and African American military service more generally, right, changed America. Right? It compelled the nation to found itself anew on the basis of liberty and equality. Right? We can think of Fort Negley's significance in terms of its place in the war effort or how it reflected military policy, and you find a lot of writing about the architecture and design of Fort Negley. But I think its more enduring significance is its function in shaping how Black Nashvillians defined and made freedom. Right? The experience of the men, women, and children who lived there and worked there and died there, it really matters because we can see freedom taking tangible shape in how they created lives as free people. And by crossing U.S. Army lines, right, by beginning to build free lives here in Nashville, they convinced so many people whom they came into contact with that the war was a war against slavery, right, and that the war was a war for freedom. So, we think about Fort Negley, right? And it's a place where there was an epical transformation, right? And fundamentally, it's a transformation of the meaning of freedom, right? And we see how freedom doesn't simply exist, right? It's not an abstract state of being, right? It's not a category we can look up in the dictionary. We all know what it means, right? It's something that has to be claimed. Now, after the war, what does freedom mean? Right? It's never a concept that simply gets frozen in amber. Right? It's a concept, it's a legal category that's always changing. So thinking about what freedom means, there was a letter in 1865 that a man who lived in Dayton, Ohio, wrote to his former master, who lived in Big Spring, Tennessee. And Jordan Anderson wrote to P.H. Anderson and said, I'm responding to your letter. It was nice to get a letter from you. I think it was a letter that basically said, come back to Tennessee. Work on the farm again. And what Jordan Anderson wrote was, I served you faithfully for 32 years, and my wife Mandy 20 years. At $25 a month for me and $2 a week for Mandy, our earnings would amount to $11,680. Add to this the interest for the time our wages have been kept back, and deduct what you paid for our clothing, and 3 doctor's visits to me, 32 years, and pulling a tooth for Mandy, and the balance will show what we are in justice entitled to. Please send the money by Adams Express in care of V. Winters, Esquire, Dayton, Ohio. And he was someone who escaped from the Anderson plantation, found his way to Nashville. And that's where he got his free papers, 1864, from the Provost Marshal General of the Department of Nashville, the Army Department of Nashville. And when you think about how he defined freedom, right? You think about this moment of emancipation, right? It's this moment when freedom is this undefined concept, right? The 13th Amendment says, essentially bans slavery and involuntary servitude. But again, it doesn't define free. right? You see him demanding payment for his work. Really important. He also asks, "You will also please state if there's been any schools open for the colored children in your neighborhood. The great desire of my life now is to give my children an education." Right? You see another way that freedom is defined. Right? So you think, what does freedom mean after emancipation? The historian Leon Litwack, right, said the key question of this moment was, how free is free? And you could think it's working for wages. It's the freedom to pursue all kinds of business opportunities. So if you think about Nashville after the war, it was relatively untouched by war, right? You look at pictures of Richmond or Columbia, South Carolina. These were cities that were just razed to ashes, right? Not so with Nashville. So compared to other southern cities, it was truly a place where money could be made, right? It was economically viable. It had this base of literate African Americans. It had this base of people who had all kinds of skills that were useful in a city, right? And people who had all kinds of experience running businesses independently, right? So that kind of ability to make money, right? Really important. And then you think about what freedom means, right, after this war. And you can think about everything that slavery took away, right? And in countering slavery, bit by bit, right, the definition of freedom takes shape. So it could be something as simple as naming oneself. Right? In slavery, people were deprived of the ability to name themselves. So naming oneself. Beyond that, reuniting families. Incredibly important. Right? We talked about just how prevalent the separation of families were from the very beginning. Right? Nashville was settled by people who had been taken from their families. Right? And that kind of family separation continued, right, year by year, decade by decade. So reuniting families, right? And you look at work by historians such as Heather Andrea Williams and Tara Hunter, right, that really focus on the incredible efforts that people made to bring their families back together. Right? Very powerful work. You could think about slavery as a moment when people just could not move freely. So just traveling freely, being able to move somewhere else, right? Moving from the plantation to the city, right? That became a hallmark of freedom. And that you see that in so many of the WPA slave narratives that were taken during the New Deal, right? Many of the people in Nashville who were giving their testimony were people who hadn't been born in Nashville, right? Some of them had, and their narratives are very, very interesting. But many of them had been slaves in Georgia, had been slaves in Alabama, had been slaves elsewhere in Tennessee. But they found their way to Nashville, right? They could travel freely. They could choose their own communities. Right? And you think about Fort Negley and the thousands of people who came to St. Cloud Hill, right? And many of them stayed, right? It was a place where the army had been, where it had been, they had safety from the army, and then they had safety in their own numbers, right? So they moved from the hill to the edge of the hill, right? Creating, right, one of the first great black neighborhoods in Nashville, right? The Edge Hill community. You also see other communities form. There are neighborhoods that became known as Black Bottom or Hell's Half Acre, which really is the back slope of the Capitol kind of moving across Bicentennial Park, right? Until really urban renewal in the 1950s, right? A large concentration, large African-American neighborhood. You also see it, communities develop in North Nashville, right? And we see, what defines freedom? What does building, choosing a community, building a community mean? And that can mean forming new churches, right? So, if you think slavery was often defined by the inability to gather independently, right? And the inability to worship independently. And so churches and parks and other cultural institutions and social spaces, those developed, and Dr. Williams will be talking about those next week. We can think about education at every level. So Daniel Watkins actually found himself competing for bodies and minds with northern schoolmarms, right, who came in and, with the Freedmen's Bureau and with the American Missionary Association, who were creating institutions such as Fisk, right? But there were also other institutions of higher education that were created. Roger Williams, Central Tennessee, / Walden / Meharry, right? And 2 weeks from now, Dr. Williams will talk about the development of educational institutions in Nashville. It could also involve militia and military service, right, continuing. Could involve the right to bear arms and act in self-defense. This is an illustration for a regiment of colored troops, U.S. colored troops, that says, "Let soldiers in war be citizens in peace." And very closely linked to militia and military service and the right to bear arms and act in self-defense was the right to develop and advocate for politics of one's own. Right? So together, collectively, in very contingent process, African Americans after the Civil War in Nashville and elsewhere were developing all kinds of new definitions of freedom, right? And advocating for them, with everything they had. But so were the people who would have kept them as slaves. Right? And we can see, beginning in the aftermath of Civil War, a century-long contest over the meaning of liberty, right? Over the meaning of equality. And, for decades that follow, we see Jim Crow segregation, right, taking hold of Tennessee and the rest of the South, right, through legal advocacy and also through terror and violence. And then we also see the foundations, very clearly in Nashville, for what historians have called a long civil rights movement. And that's what we'll be exploring in 3 weeks' time in our final class. All right, I'm going to wrap up now. We have 15 minutes for questions. Thank you. Yes?
Going back to the primary schools before the Civil War, you didn't say anything about the churches being connected to the founding of the primary schools. In fact,
Yeah, so they weren't directly affiliated with churches, but there were elders in churches white elders in churches who were, very important sort of patrons of those schools.
Because you did mention that some people wanted to learn how to read so they could read the Bible.
Exactly. And that became a basis for, convincing people who would otherwise shut down such a school, right, that this was okay. And, maybe there were arguments that, people will learn how to read the Bible and, they will be, even more docile and compliant people in Nashville. Not true. Yes.
When we talk about higher education as a form of freedom in the antebellum years before the Civil War, I have noted that there was a resort located in what is called Carroll, Ohio, close to the city of Negley, Ohio, where an institution by the name of
Wilberforce. Yep.
founded in about 1855 and 56. And my understanding is that many slave owners, with their slave mistresses and concubines and children, would bring them to the Carroll Springs resort and would later educate their slave children, the mixed-race children, at Wilberforce University. Do we have any evidence that any slave owner in Nashville afforded that opportunity to any of the mixed-race children here in Nashville to get any higher education at a place like that? Or perhaps at the first co-ed, fully integrated college in America, Berea College,
Mm-hmm.
located in Berea, Kentucky. And both these institutions would have been a little closer to Nashville than any other place on the East Coast. It might have been available. But I don't know if you have any history of any slave children or any free blacks in either of those schools.
Yeah. That's a great question. So I actually was just reading, so your account of Wilberforce is spot on, right? So there's a question about African Americans in Nashville attending various higher education institutions before the war. I was just reading an amazing manuscript really wonderful manuscript about a slave owner in Huntsville, Alabama, who sent his children to Wilberforce. And I haven't done research into Nashvillians going to Wilberforce or Berea. I think of as really sort of post-war as an institution. And I certainly can imagine Tennesseans going to Berea before it was forcibly resegregated at the beginning of the 20th century by Kentucky statute that was upheld by the Supreme Court. Oberlin is another really important school. So, before the Civil War, Oberlin, Ohio was the most abolitionist place in America. And it was a place where it was educating African Americans and whites, men and women together. Students from Oberlin were heading to Bleeding, Kansas to fight in John Brown's army. I'm trying to think where James Carroll Napier went to college. again, definitely these were places where people from the South and from the North, wound up, and I can't, I can't just off the top of my head name people who went there, but for the vast majority of Black Nashvillians, Fisk and Roger Williams and Central Tennessee and eventually Tennessee A&I, right? These were institutions that made higher education, in the decades immediately following the war, so much more accessible than it had ever been, and it was a really it's hard to underestimate their impact on African Americans in Nashville, but really African Americans across the country. I mean, in terms of Oberlin, I do know that the Napier family, at least after the Civil War, had very strong connections to Oberlin, particularly through Napier's wife, Nettie Langston Napier, who her family, her father, her uncles had gone to Oberlin in the 1840s. I think the Napiers sent their children to Oberlin, but their papers wound up at Fisk, which is really great. Yes.
Could you help me understand more specifically how the Emancipation Proclamation impacted Nashville? Because my understanding was that it did not apply to Nashville because Nashville was occupied by the Union. The Emancipation Proclamation freed only those slaves, I believe, who were in rebellious states.
Yes, that's absolutely true. But what it meant was for places that were not under Union occupation, there was mass flight, right? And people claiming their freedom, under the Emancipation Proclamation, right? So, within Nashville, there would, you could find, holdouts who were keeping people in bondage. But it was very hard to enforce that. People would join the army, so they would leave their bondage. People would just go away, and it was very hard to get them back. Find any authority who would force them back, right? And so, the Emancipation Proclamation, even though it was very specifically geographically tailored, it did make freedom the end game of the Union war effort, right? And so much of the Nashville story during and after the Civil War, people from outside of Nashville coming in, right? And seeking the asylum among the U.S. Army, right, who weren't going to deport them back to slavery. Yes?
You made reference to the colored regiment in Peachtree. Was that the first, or was that?
No. I mean, not nationwide. You can find. If you see the movie Glory, right, the Massachusetts 54th was the first regiment of U.S. colored troops, and they fought in different places. The famed charge on Fort Wagner was in 1863. So 1863 was really when the government, in Frederick Douglass's words, put eagles on our buttons. Yes?
You ended your talk with the fact that there were those who resisted the freedom effort, but freedom actually meant. I would really appreciate if you could go into more detail. Who literally were the resistors setting up the Jim Crow law? Because that's not discussed in terms of detail.
Yeah, so good question. And I don't want to spoil too much of week 6. But I will say Tennessee is an interesting place because we wouldn't think it now just by I don't know, the informal measure of you head east on I-40 and the frequency with which you see Confederate flags it goes way up. But East Tennessee was a Republican stronghold. It was Unionist. Right, there were very few, comparatively few slave owners, right? And then West Tennessee was where the really huge plantation economy was rooted, and the state itself was very closely divided, right? And so during and immediately after Reconstruction, African Americans potentially are this really important swing vote. And there are moments where you see Democrats actually trying to gesture towards competing for black votes, but they get over it, right? And this interesting thing is they immediately turn towards trying to use race as a wedge, trying to disenfranchise African Americans, trying to segregate public accommodations and common carriers, right? And so Tennessee actually kind of leads the South in various measures. And so the fight to, I tell my students, if you look at letters from the late 19th century by people like the great African-American educator and writer Anna Julia Cooper. She'll use Jim Crow as a verb, right? This thing was Jim Crowed, they Jim Crowed that. Often the they were people she referred to as angry Saxons, right? And Tennessee was a place where, everything was immediately in play. And it was just a fierce struggle over, how liberty, how equality, how politics in Tennessee would work. We have time maybe for one more question? Trying to keep us on schedule. Yes?
Are you going to talk about the suffragist movement and the role of African Americans in Nashville in the suffragist happening of the suffrage?
That's a great question. I haven't written my lecture for week 6, so how about for you? I'll do my best. All right, thank you, everybody.